Good evening from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now, and welcome to our live coverage of the launch of Hispasat's Amazonas Nexus satellite on board a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. Liftoff is scheduled for 8:32 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:32 a.m. UTC from Pad 40. At Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, you're looking at a live view of Pad 40 right now, where liftoff is an hour and 1 minute away, 1 hour, 1 minute until launch of the Falcon 9 rocket. The launch time has been delayed this evening by 3 hours. The launch window actually opened at 5:32 p.m. 2 hours ago. But SpaceX took some extra time to complete their pre-launch checkouts this afternoon and this evening. But at last report, liftoff is now on track, on schedule for 8:32 p.m. Eastern Time. The launch attempt yesterday, for those of you who have been following this mission, you'll know that the launch attempt yesterday was scrubbed in the evening hours because of unfavorable weather, both here at the launch site and at the drone ship location out in the Atlantic Ocean east of Cape Canaveral. Conditions are more favorable today, actually nearly ideal for a launch today here at Cape Canaveral, and conditions have improved downrange at the drone ship location as well. So everything looking good right now for liftoff in 1 hour of the Amazonas Nexus satellite on top of the Falcon 9 rocket. The Falcon 9 out on Pad 40 stands 229 feet or 70 meters in height. It's a two-stage vehicle. The bottom two-thirds of the launch vehicle in this view with that brownish gray soot scorch covering, that's comprising the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. That first stage has actually been to space and back 5 times and is no longer that pristine white that we see with new rockets. Above that, the black band is the interstage. That's the connection between the upper stage and the first stage Falcon of the Falcon 9. And the upper stage is that bright white color because it's a new part of the rocket. That's the only major part of the Falcon 9 that is not reusable. And then above that, the diameter tapers out a bit. That's the payload fairing. That's where the Amazonas Nexus satellite is sitting buttoned up for liftoff this evening from Cape Canaveral. The flashing lights that you see on top of the towers on each side of the Falcon 9, those are aviation hazard lights on top of the 4 lightning protection masts at Pad 40. These towers are there to protect the Falcon 9 rocket from any threat of lightning while it's vertical on the pad. There is no lightning in the area. In fact, the skies are nearly perfectly clear this evening on Florida's Space Coast. So we should have great visibility of the Falcon 9 as it heads down range, heading off to the east over the Atlantic Ocean. T-minus 51 minutes and 30 seconds until the launch time of 8:32 p.m. Eastern Time for SpaceX's Falcon 9 launch with the Amazonas Nexus spacecraft for Hispasat. This spacecraft is owned by Hispasat, which is a company based in Madrid, Spain. The satellite was built by Thales Alenia Space, and it's based on the Thales Spacebus Neo platform, which is one of the new generation satellite buses developed by European space companies. Thales's is called the Spacebus Neo platform with a reconfigurable digital payload. Also has all electric propulsion, so there's no liquid propellant on board this particular spacecraft. It's all plasma propulsion to do all the orbital maneuvers necessary throughout the life of the spacecraft. This spacecraft weighs 9,140 pounds or 4.1 metric tons in launch configuration. The Falcon 9 rocket will be deploying the satellite into an elliptical transfer orbit with a high point several tens of thousands of miles above the Earth. And then the plasma propulsion system on board this spacecraft will reshape that orbit over the course of several months into a circular geostationary orbit, and the spacecraft will settle into a position in geostationary orbit about 22,000 miles over the equator at 61 degrees west longitude. Should be ready to begin operational service this summer. It has Ku-band and Ka-band telecommunications payloads on board, and the main purpose of the spacecraft is for mobile connectivity over the Americas, Greenland, and the Atlantic Ocean. Here's an artist's concept from Thales Alenia Space, the builder of the satellite, showing what the spacecraft looks like in orbit once it unfurls its solar panels and antennas. We're going to play a video now from Hispasat with some animation and some overview of the spacecraft and its mission. So Amazonas Nexus is designed to link users on land, at sea, and in the air. This animation shows again what the spacecraft looks like in its fully deployed configuration. It'll be joining a fleet of a little more than a half dozen satellites in Hispasat's network. Amazonas Nexus will be at 61 degrees west longitude over the equator, and it will have coverage areas over the Americas and over the Atlantic Ocean corridor as well as Greenland. It'll be providing in-flight Wi-Fi through the service formerly known as GoGo, now renamed Intelsat Commercial Aviation. It'll be linking remote communities in the Amazon, in Latin America, as well as in Greenland. It also has a payload on board from the United States Space Force called Pathfinder 2 that will supplement the military's government-owned communications satellites for military connectivity. And this digital processor on board allows Hispasat to reconfigure the beams of the satellites to meet changing demand over the course of the satellite's 15-year mission. As I mentioned, the spacecraft was built by Thales Alenia Space based on the Spacebus Neo platform with all-electric propulsion. The spacecraft stands about 6 meters or 20 feet tall in launch configuration. These solar panels, when they're deployed, will extend more than 30 meters or 100 feet tip to tip. The spacecraft will replace the Amazonas 2 satellite, which was launched in 2009. So I want to thank Hispasat for that video showing what we can expect from Amazonas Nexus over the course of its mission in space. I had the chance to speak with Ignacio Sanchis, the Chief Commercial Officer of Hispasat, last week. He talked to me a little bit about the Hispasat Amazonas Nexus mission and how the spacecraft will fit into the company's network.
So Amazonas Nexus is the most advanced satellite of Hispasat fleet. It's a very special satellite. It's a very powerful HTS satellite, which incorporates also leading-edge digital processor, so provides a great deal of flexibility in the configuration of the payload. That makes it really a different asset within our fleet, fully devoted to connectivity services in various verticals. The satellite will cover all of the Americas plus the North Atlantic and South Atlantic corridor. And you can already guess from that one of the main target markets for this satellite is mobility, in particular in-flight connectivity and maritime. But we will also be providing connectivity services for government and corporations in the fields of energy, oil and gas, etc., as well as telcos and mobile network operators in extending their cellular networks through cellular backhaul. So all of these are the main target markets for Amazonas Nexus. So indeed, it's a high throughput satellite, but rather than focusing it on residential or consumer broadband, we are focusing it on premium corporate applications, as I said, as mobility, maritime in-flight, and other corporate and telco applications. This is the focus of this satellite. The satellite, the sales pre-launch have performed very well. That's another attribute of the satellite that is going to be launched, having been sold in more than 2/3 already, which is a significant landmark for us. We're very happy and we're very confident looking at the good demand prospect in the regions where we have the pending capacity, that we will be able to fill in the remaining capacity at a good pace. The capacity in some of the largest markets in Latin America has already been taken by one of our customers, but we have still a lot of capacity in the other markets. There we will focus in, as I said before, in cellular backhaul for MNOs and telco operators, corporate networks, but also a number of programs we developed with several governments in the region to reduce the digital divide by connecting rural communities, including connecting schools, providing telemedicine applications, and other of the kind. It does replace, to a large extent, Amazonas 2, and will be located in the same orbital position, 61 west degrees, where we also have operate, by the way, Amazonas 3 and Amazonas 5. All of them are co-located. But while it actually will replace over time Amazonas 2, it's a totally different concept. As I said, Amazonas 2 had also a focus on video applications, broadcast, DTH in Latin America, while Amazonas Nexus is fully devoted to connectivity. And not just Latin America, but a big deal of the capacity is devoted to North America and North Atlantic, as explained before. I can mention some of the customers that already signed on Amazonas Nexus. We've been announcing this over the last year or so. So, for instance, we have a hosted payload for the U.S. Space Force. It's called Pathfinder 2, and we're doing this in cooperation with the American government service provider Artel. We also provide a dedicated and specifically designed payload for the national telecom operator of Greenland, TUSAS. So we will help them to connect all the towns and citizens located in the north and in the east of Greenland, plus other industries such as the farms of minery there. And we also have Intelsat, which the former Intelsat Commercial Aviation, the former Gogo, which is using our Amazonas Nexus capacity to connect mainly aircrafts in their in-flight connectivity service for the domestic market of the US and some other regions. We are targeting the full enter of service of the satellite after having been raised to its final orbit and having performed the in-orbit testing by somewhere probably in July, a little bit at the beginning of the second half of the year. That's our target period for starting the service.
That was Ignacio Sanchis, the Chief Commercial Officer of Hispasat, who had the time to talk to me last week about this Amazonas Nexus mission that we're hoping to see launch tonight at 8:32 p.m., 1:32 a.m. UTC. I mentioned the spacecraft was built by Thales Alenia Space in France, in Cannes, France. That's where their satellite integration facility is located. The satellite was actually flown across the Atlantic Ocean on a Ukrainian Antonov cargo plane back in mid-January for preparations ahead of this launch opportunity this week with SpaceX. This video from Thales Alenia Space shows the shipment of the spacecraft leaving the factory in Cannes, being driven to the airport in nearby Nice in the south of France, and then being loaded onto the Ukrainian Antonov AN-124 cargo plane. This heavy lift transport aircraft flew this spacecraft from Nice to Cape Canaveral last month for final launch preparations. After arriving at Cape Canaveral, the spacecraft was integrated with its payload adapter and then was encapsulated inside the Falcon 9's payload fairing in preparation for launch, and then was actually integrated. That entire payload compartment was integrated in a horizontal configuration over in SpaceX's hangar just south of Pad 40, and then the entire fully assembled Falcon 9 launch vehicle rolled out a few days ago and was raised vertical in preparation for the launch attempt yesterday, which, as I mentioned at the start of our broadcast, was scrubbed due to unfavorable weather. But the weather conditions are favorable for launch this evening. Right now, the poll of the SpaceX launch team is underway. This is an electronic poll to verify that all of the stations on the launch team are ready to proceed with propellant loading tonight. The team will also give their final go or no-go for launch during this poll. We're going to stand by for word from SpaceX, hopefully in the next couple of minutes, on the outcome of that poll. If everything looks good, propellant loading is set to begin at T-minus 35 minutes, about 4 minutes from now.
This is the launch director with abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
That was the voice from SpaceX Launch Control, giving the team their instructions in the event of any abort during the final countdown sequence. Once the propellant loading begins at T-minus 35 minutes, the command of the countdown will be in control of an automated computer sequencer. So it'll be hands-off from the launch team if everything goes according to plan. All of the final steps to configure the ground systems and the Falcon 9 rocket will all be executed by the computer, with the launch team looking over the computer's shoulders, so to speak. At T-minus 60 seconds, control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer.
Falcon 9 tanks are venting for the start of prop load.
the calls that we're hearing from SpaceX Launch Control and bringing to you on our live stream here all indicate everything is proceeding for the start of propellant loading in just about a minute and a half. This would set up for a launch time of 8:32 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:32 a.m. UTC. If you're just joining us, you're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40, where a Falcon 9 rocket stands ready for propellant loading and launch tonight at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. If you haven't done so already, please hit the thumbs up or the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us get a larger audience for our launch coverage. That really helps us out, so please do that if you haven't done that already. You can support our coverage also by becoming a member of our YouTube channel by hitting the join button to help us continue our coverage of launch activity here at Cape Canaveral and around the world. You can also contribute and help us out by donating in the Super Chat. We want to thank those of you who have already done so this evening. We really appreciate your support.
Launch auto sequence has started.
And we just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the launch auto sequence has started, and this marks that transition to the ground computer controlling the countdown, as well as marks the start of propellant loading. So SpaceX is now loading about 1 million pounds of densified kerosene and liquid oxygen into the Falcon 9 rocket out on pad 40. The kerosene will continue loading into the rocket until about T-minus 5.5 minutes. Liquid oxygen loading will continue down until T-minus 2 minutes. T-minus 32 minutes, 32 seconds, and counting. Here's a look at the countdown timeline this evening. We've already passed a couple of these milestones. The SpaceX launch team was verified go for propellant loading a few minutes ago, and then at T-minus 35 minutes, that's when the propellant loading actually began. So 3 of the 4 propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket are currently being filled with propellants. The first stage kerosene fuel tank, as well as the first stage liquid oxygen, the oxidizer tank, are currently being loaded. And the kerosene fuel tank on stage 2 is also being filled at this time. At T-minus 20 minutes, the kerosene tank on the second stage will actually be full, already to its flight level. And then at that point, preparations will get underway on stage 2 to load liquid oxygen. That'll begin at T-minus 16 minutes. At T-minus 7 minutes, the thermal conditioning or chill down of the first stage 9 Merlin engines will begin. At about 5.5 minutes before launch, the first stage will be full of kerosene. At that point, the kerosene on both stages will be fully loaded. In parallel with this, around this time, final checks will be underway for the range safety destruct system, the flight termination system, as well as checks of the navigation system and all other components and elements of the Falcon 9 launch vehicle. Also in the countdown, in the final minutes, the Amazonas Nexus spacecraft, the payload, will be switched over to internal power for launch. At 4.5 minutes, the strong back on the right side of the Falcon 9 in this view will be retracted to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. That's where it'll stay until T0, when it will swing back in a more rapid fashion. At T-minus 2 minutes, the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with liquid oxygen. At that point, SpaceX will have a fully loaded, fully fueled launch vehicle. At T-minus 60 seconds, command of the countdown will be switched over to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer, and the propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 will be brought up to flight pressure. We should hear a final call from SpaceX's launch director at T-minus 45 seconds for a final go for launch. And then the engine ignition sequence will begin at T-minus 3 seconds. That's when the engine controller will command the 9 first stage engines to light. After an automated health check, if everything looks good, the Falcon 9 will be released for liftoff at T0. 4 hydraulic hold-down clamps will release to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its climb off of the pad. Now 30 minutes until launch of the Falcon 9 rocket from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Everything looking good. This will be the 9th launch by SpaceX this year. Their 7th from here in Florida. If you look closely out at pad 40, you can see some of the vapors just appearing on the outer skin, around the outer skin of the first stage booster. This vapor is caused by the loading of cryogenic oxidizer. This liquid oxygen that's going into the vehicle is chilled down to several hundred degrees below zero. So it's very cold, and once that oxidizer is flowed into the rocket, the outer skin, the fuselage, so to speak, of the booster actually gets covered with some frost and ice. That's normal. And with this booster having some scorch marks from previous flights to space, if you watch closely over the next 10-15 minutes or so, you can actually see the frost and ice level rise on that first stage liquid oxygen tank. The very bottom of the first stage is actually where the kerosene fuel tank is located, and the kerosene is kept closer to room temperature, so we won't see the buildup of frost and ice around the very bottom of the vehicle. 28.5 minutes to go until launch from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. T-minus 27 minutes, 5 seconds, and counting. We're going to share a few photos that our photographer Michael Kane actually took out at pad 40 over the last, actually yesterday, before the first launch attempt for this mission. Here's a photo showing the payload fairing with the logo for Amazonas Nexus emblazoned on the side. At the very top of the payload fairing, I'll draw your attention to a sort of a more gray-orange color at the very top of the payload fairing, that's actually part of the thermal protection system that protects the payload fairing from the heat of reentry, because SpaceX not only recovers and reuses the first stage booster of the Falcon 9, the payload fairing halves, which will come apart in a clamshell-like fashion a few minutes after launch, actually parachute into the ocean. SpaceX recovers them from the sea with a recovery vessel downrange. Here's another good shot from Michael Kane of Cold Life Photography, who provides us with beautiful images of rockets and launches. This is, again, a view from Pad 40 yesterday. And one more shot of the Falcon 9 booster. This is booster 1073 in SpaceX's inventory. It's flown to space and back 5 times before. And you can see the SpaceX logo, the SpaceX writing there, stylized writing on the side of the Falcon 9 booster. On the left-hand side is an up-close view of the strong back that I was talking about earlier. That's what will be retracted away from the rocket in the final minutes of the countdown. Still seeing that frost and vapor being building up on the Falcon 9 first stage as propellant loading continues. T-minus 25 minutes. T-minus 24 minutes and 15 seconds and counting. Here's a view of the mission patch from SpaceX for this launch. This patch, of course, has the SpaceX and Falcon 9 in writing, as well as the name of the payload, Amazonas Nexus, and the customer, Hispasat, as well as an artist illustration of what the satellite looks like when it's up in orbit, fully deployed. And, of course, the four-leaf clover, a regular feature of all SpaceX mission patches, for good luck. This feature of the four-leaf clover actually dates back to the days of SpaceX's Falcon 1 rocket, which was SpaceX's first orbital launch vehicle. This mission will be heading east from Cape Canaveral, targeting an equatorial orbit. This red line shows the approximate ground track of the Falcon 9 as it heads downrange over the Atlantic Ocean. We've labeled the location of Space Launch Complex 40 here, as well as the location of the drone ship. Just read the instructions, which is floating about 400 miles east of the Cape. That's where the booster will make its landing tonight. A little farther downrange is the location of one of SpaceX's recovery ships that will retrieve the 2 halves of the payload fairing from the Atlantic Ocean after they parachute into the sea. So again, this is an easterly launch tonight with Hispasat's Amazonas Nexus spacecraft. This easterly trajectory is necessary to allow this spacecraft to eventually maneuver into an orbit directly over the equator at an altitude of more than 22,000 miles, nearly 36,000 kilometers.
Stage 1 Pogo.
We just saw a helicopter pass behind the pad. If you had an eagle eye, you may have seen that. This is one of the Coast Guard helicopters, likely, that is surveying the area, making sure all of the waters and airspace around the launch area are clear. Coming up on the so-called big vent, we should see a vent of gaseous oxygen vapor from the strong back beginning in a few moments. That will mark the start of thermal conditioning or chill down for liquid oxygen loading on the upper stage. Now we're seeing that vent coming from the strong back now. This is a customary part of all of SpaceX's Falcon 9 countdowns, and a good sign, good indicator that the countdown is proceeding normally. The propellant loading is proceeding as expected. Now 20 minutes until liftoff of the Falcon 9. At this point, the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket should be fully loaded.
Stage 2 RP1 load complete.
And there's the call, RP1 load complete on stage 2. So kerosene loading is complete on the upper stage of the Falcon 9. RP1 stands for Rocket Propellant 1. It's a highly refined rocket-grade kerosene that's used in various types of launch vehicles, not only the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, but also United Launch Alliance's Atlas V, Russia's Soyuz rocket, and even dating back to the Apollo era, the Saturn V moon rocket that NASA used for the Apollo missions to the moon also used RP1 or kerosene fuel. This vent that you're seeing is part of a purge and thermal conditioning of the liquid oxygen transfer line that runs up the strong back and into the second stage. So that line is currently being conditioned for the start of liquid oxygen loading onto the upper stage in about 3 minutes.
LD, this is MM. The spacecraft is on internal power. Over.
Copy, thank you.
That call from the payload mission manager confirms that the Amazonas Nexus spacecraft has been switched over to its own internal battery supply. It's now operating off of, or it's now been transitioned off of the ground power supply and is on its internal battery. This is one of the final steps to configure the payload for launch. It will remain running off of this battery on the satellite until the deployment of the solar arrays after the spacecraft deploys from the Falcon 9 rocket. That will occur once the spacecraft is in orbit and will allow these batteries to be recharged on the spacecraft. 17 minutes, 17 seconds to go.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And there's the call from SpaceX Launch Control confirming the start of liquid oxygen loading on the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. This is the final propellant tank to be loaded tonight. 16 minutes until liftoff now. Just to recap, the upper stage kerosene fuel tank is already fully loaded. Liquid oxygen loading on the second stage just started. And both tanks, kerosene and liquid oxygen on the first stage, continue to be filled for flight this evening. "15 minutes until liftoff." Here's a look at the timeline of key events for tonight's mission. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 will be heading east over the Atlantic Ocean, as we talked about a little earlier in our broadcast. It'll take about a minute for the rocket to surpass the speed of sound. It'll reach the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure, or max Q, about a minute 12 seconds into the flight. The first stage booster will burn 2.5 minutes. This is a standard profile for SpaceX's Falcon 9 missions. A few seconds later, that first stage booster will separate and detach and begin its descent into the Atlantic Ocean for landing on the drone ship. The second stage will light its single Merlin vacuum engine at T plus 2 minutes and 41 seconds. That'll be a roughly 5.5 minute burn to place the Amazonas Nexus spacecraft into a preliminary parking orbit. The payload fairing, the nose cone that surrounds the Amazonas Nexus spacecraft, will jettison at about 3.5 minutes into the flight, and then we'll begin to see the recovery maneuvers on the first stage. It'll relight 3 of its engines for a braking maneuver and entry burn at 6 minutes 6 seconds into the flight. That'll last 30 seconds. That will slow down that booster as it descends deeper into the atmosphere. The first stage will begin its landing burn using just a single engine, its center engine, at about 8 minutes into the flight, setting up for landing on the drone ship 8.5 minutes after liftoff. For this booster. This booster, again, is making its 6th flight to space. At 8 minutes 6 seconds, while that first stage is making its final landing burn, the upper stage should cut off its engine after reaching that preliminary low-altitude parking orbit. It'll coast across the Atlantic Ocean, and once in a position near the west coast of Africa, near the equator, that second stage engine will relight for about a minute-long burn. That will actually accelerate the velocity of the rocket and the spacecraft. It'll accelerate that velocity, allowing the spacecraft to enter a more elliptical or elongated orbit with an apogee or high point stretching more than 20,000 miles, well over 20,000 miles above the Earth. And that will set up for a deployment of Amazonas Nexus from the rocket's upper stage at 35 minutes and 44 seconds. Again, the booster flying tonight, booster 1073, in SpaceX's inventory, has flown 5 times before. It debuted back on May the 14th of 2022. Here's a look at its flight history. It has launched 3 different missions for SpaceX's Starlink internet network. It launched back on June 29th of last year with the SES-22, a geostationary television broadcasting satellite. And then most recently, on December the 11th, about 2 months ago, it launched from here at Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral with the Hakuto-R spacecraft. That's a commercial moon lander currently making its way toward the moon, targeting a landing on the lunar surface in April. So these are the missions that Booster 1073 has racked up to date. 1 more on tap this evening. 10 minutes, 20 seconds until liftoff. You can see that frost level on the first stage liquid oxygen tank now nearing full. SpaceX is about 25 minutes into that propellant loading process with liquid oxygen on the first stage. 25 minutes into that loading now, 8 minutes to go until that tank is full. T-minus 10 minutes and counting. This will be SpaceX's 9th launch of the year, their 7th from here in Florida. It's also SpaceX's 2nd launch in the company's history for Hispasat. That's the customer for this mission, carrying that company's Amazonas Nexus satellite into orbit. T-minus 9 minutes and counting. Again, the first stage booster for this mission will be targeting a landing on SpaceX's drone ship. This drone ship, named Just Read the Instructions, it's one of 3 rocket landing platforms that SpaceX has, 2 here on the East Coast, 1 on the West Coast out in California. And this graphic from SpaceX shows some of the maneuvers the rocket will perform while that upper stage continues into orbit on the primary mission with Amazonas Nexus. The first stage will conduct a flip maneuver, deploy its hypersonic grid fins, be using cold gas thrusters, nitrogen thrusters to control its orientation in space. It'll coast up to an apogee or high point on its trajectory, and then descend back into the atmosphere, targeting that landing on the drone ship, which is about the size of a football field floating out in the Atlantic Ocean. If you're just joining our coverage and you haven't done so, we invite you to please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us get a largest audience possible for our coverage. That's one way you can really help us out. We'd appreciate that. Again, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. If you want to support our coverage, if you enjoy what we do, please consider becoming a member of our YouTube channel. You can click the join button. You'll be supporting our coverage with that contribution. And you can gain access to exclusive members-only video features that we have just for our supporters on our YouTube channel. You can also contribute here on our Super Chat. We've had several of you do so throughout the evening, and we really appreciate that support as well. The countdown has just passed the T-minus 7-minute mark, so thermal conditioning or chill down of the Falcon 9's 9 Merlin Windy engines has started. We just heard that call. I apologize for speaking over the member of the launch team there, but we've now just received confirmation of that. Now 6.5 minutes until liftoff. One of the next big milestones will be the completion of kerosene fueling on the first stage.
Stage 1, RP1 load is complete.
And there's the call confirming that the first stage RP1 load is complete. So the first stage has its full supply of rocket-grade kerosene, or RP1, on board. Liquid oxygen loading continues, however, for the next few minutes. That will be terminated at T-minus 2 minutes. Now T-minus 5 minutes and counting. So 46,000 gallons of kerosene fuel now on board the Falcon 9 rocket. At this time, final checks of the guidance system and the navigation system on the Falcon 9 should be nearing completion. There also should have been a check a few moments ago of the flight safety system. That's the range safety destruct system that would be ordered to destroy the vehicle in the event of a major malfunction after launch.
Falcon 9 tanks are pressurizing for strong back retract.
T-minus 4.5 minutes. Preparations now beginning for retraction of the strong back. That's the structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 rocket. That'll be reclined to an angle of about 1.5 to 1.8 degrees or so. And then at liftoff, that will swing away at a faster rate to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its climb off the pad.
Strong back lower has started.
Strong back lowering now underway. This begins with opening of clamps at the very top of the Falcon 9 to allow that strong back to begin retracting. T-minus 4 minutes and counting. I'm going to hand off to my colleague Stephen Young in the next few moments. He'll be providing updates in the final few minutes of the countdown as well as the initial phase of flight as the Falcon 9 begins its journey to space tonight with the Amazonas Nexus communications satellite for Hispasat.
We're now just minutes away from the launch of the Falcon 9, coming up on the T-minus 3 minute mark. The rocket's destruct system will be armed shortly and liquid oxygen topping will be terminated. T-minus 3 minutes.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
There's the confirmation of LOX load complete.
Stage 1 POGO.
T-minus 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Very shortly, we should be hearing the call that stage 2 LOX load is complete, and the rocket will be fully loaded with its 1 million pounds of fuel and liquid oxygen. Two minutes to launch. T-minus 1 minute, 30
Stage
seconds.
2 LOX load is complete.
Ground closeouts should have started soon. Seeing some venting, more venting from the strong back structure.
Ground gas closeouts has started.
T-minus 1 minute, the vehicle's onboard computers will take control. We'll be hearing the final go from the launch director soon.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
SpaceX LD, go for launch.
There it is, the final go from the launch director. T-minus 20. The Falcon 9's Merlin engines will start their ignition sequence at T-minus 3 minutes, 3 seconds. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 with the Amazonas Nexus satellite. And the Falcon 9 has cleared the lightning towers and is roaring away. The sound should reach our cameras at the Kennedy Space Center press site shortly. There you hear the roar of the Merlin engines. We'll soon be coming up on the period of maximum dynamic stress on the vehicle. Beautiful contrail forming as the vehicle passes through the speed of sound as it arcs across the sky. We're now 2 minutes into flight. The Falcon 9's upper stage engine is being chilled. Beautiful views of the Falcon 9, the color in its plume, its 9 Merlin engines, power it towards orbit. Coming up on main engine cutoff. There's main engine cutoff. Should see second stage ignition shortly. Second stage ignition by the appearance of the view we're getting from the Cape here. The Merlin vacuum engine is now continuing the Falcon 9's vault into orbit. Starting to see some plume effects. The spacecraft climbs. Now 3.5 minutes into flight. There's the separation of the payload fairing, these views coming from SpaceX with a little bit of a delay. The split screen view shows the Falcon 9 second stage. Now we've switched to another view that shows the red hot engine, the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage. As the second stage climbs towards orbit, the first stage is on a trajectory to take it to a drone ship stationed in the Atlantic Ocean. You can see here in this view, the top white line is the trajectory that the second stage should follow, and the lower white line is the first stage trajectory. The blue line is the impact line should something go awry on the mission and the vehicle lose propulsion. The blue line shows where the vehicle would fall. Now 5 minutes into flight. We're keeping an eye out for the entry burn on the first stage. That should begin in about 30 seconds. Hoping we might catch a view of that from our camera at Cape Canaveral. We've not seen the usual video from the first stage. However, it is very dark out there, and perhaps the cameras are not picking up enough for SpaceX to think it worthy of showing us. Looking out for that entry burn. There it is. There's the entry burn. Falcon first stage is firing its engines to slow its descent. Seeing this view from our camera at the Kennedy Space Center press site. And there's cutoff. And here's another view coming in from SpaceX of the same thing. This is a little delayed, so the burn had already actually finished, but the SpaceX feed comes to us with a little bit of delay, just over 10 seconds. A little bit of a view from the onboard camera. And just make out the cloud deck and few firings of the cold gas thrusters on the Falcon first stage as it steers itself towards the drone ship. We're still seeing the second stage of the Falcon 9 in the sky in our view from Kennedy Space Center. Back to the SpaceX broadcast. We're now 7.5 minutes into flight. The gauges on the right of the screen show the second stage telemetry, and on the left, the telemetry from the first stage, which you can see is descending rapidly and speed is also dropping. We have shut down the second stage. Have a successful drone ship. A view from an onboard camera of the switch to the second stage Merlin vacuum engine, which is its first burn. It will reignite at 41 seconds. Amazonas now in a coast phase. It's quite possibly the moon in this view. Getting a view of the moon at the Kennedy, I believe, quite moon from Falcon 9. Our camera
Now, 14 minutes since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now. I want to thank our publisher Stephen Young for taking over commentary in the final moments of the countdown while I stepped outside and enjoyed the show and operated the camera here at Kennedy Space Center. The Falcon 9 upper stage is currently over the Atlantic Ocean, right over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, heading east toward the west coast of Africa. About 12 minutes until that upper stage relights its engine. Now, 16 minutes and 10 seconds since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. We want to apologize for those of you who suffered a buffering issue. We had a connectivity issue here at the Kennedy Space Center, but I believe our stream is back up now. Plus 17 minutes. We hope you enjoyed our live video of the Falcon 9 blasting off from Pad 40. This was the 202nd flight of a Falcon 9 rocket, the 9th SpaceX launch of the year, as well as the 7th launch of the year from here on Florida's Space Coast. Still about 9 minutes to go until the restart of the upper stage engine. This will be about a minute-long burn to accelerate the Amazonas Nexus spacecraft to a higher velocity. It will raise the apogee or high point of its orbit above 20,000 miles or above 30,000 kilometers in altitude, and that's the altitude, or that's the orbit rather, where the Falcon 9 will be releasing the spacecraft at T plus 36 minutes. Everything looking good so far. The Falcon 9 upper stage in a parking orbit as expected. The first stage successfully landed on the drone ship. Just read the instructions about 8.5 minutes after launch. Some of you may have missed that due to the connectivity issue we had. We apologize for that issue. But we did see that happen live, and everything was good with that landing, completing the 6th flight to space for this first stage booster. We're going to show a replay of the Falcon 9's booster landing for those of you who missed it in our live coverage due to that connectivity networking issue we had. The Falcon 9 booster landed successfully on the drone ship about 8.5 minutes after liftoff. On the left-hand side, this replay shows a split-screen view. On the left side, you see that first stage booster descending through some clouds, heading for the drone ship about 400 miles off the coast east of Cape Canaveral. You can see on the right-hand side a view from the drone ship itself. And there's the landing of the first stage, Booster 1073, on the deck of the drone ship. Just read the instructions. Completing its 6th flight to space, the 170th landing of a Falcon booster overall. We're back live now, 21 minutes, 33 seconds into the flight. Falcon 9 and Amazonas Nexus flying off the west coast of Africa, heading southeast. About 5 minutes left until the restart of the upper stage engine for that orbit adjustment maneuver. That'll be about a 1-minute burn by that upper stage engine.
Acquisition of signal, Gabon.
That call from SpaceX launch control indicating the upper stage is now in range of a ground station near Libreville in Gabon in the western part of Africa. About 2 minutes until the relight or restart of the second stage engine. That is due to occur at T+26 minutes and 41 seconds. That burn will actually be occurring at about the same time as the rocket intersects the equator. That will allow this burn to actually not only boost the Amazonas Nexus satellite into a higher elliptical orbit, but will allow the thrust from that upper stage engine to actually maneuver or nudge the spacecraft into an orbit that's closer to the equator. It will reduce the inclination of the orbit to a more equatorial orbit. The Falcon 9 will then release the Amazonas Nexus payload into this highly elliptical, low inclination orbit, and then the satellite will use its own propulsion system to reshape its orbit to a circular path directly over the equator. About 40 seconds now until that restart of the upper stage engine. We're showing some views from SpaceX, which actually come with about a 15 to 20 second delay. So we may not see the engine light until a few moments after the appointed time. See some of the chill down preparations there, some of the venting to prepare that engine for ignition. And there's a visual confirmation of engine startup. The Merlin vacuum engine on the upper stage of the Falcon 9 now firing. This engine produces about 200,000 pounds of thrust as it's chugging kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants. That's a rather high thrust level for an upper stage of a rocket. And the rocket will only need about a minute of thrust from this engine, from this high power engine, to do the work necessary to place Amazonas Nexus into this highly elliptical supersynchronous transfer orbit. Again, this burn is expected to last about a minute. Should be just a few moments away from engine cutoff. See the velocity increasing as this engine continues firing. And there's engine shutdown, reaching a max velocity of 35,872 kilometers per hour. See that velocity now decreasing as the engine has cut off and the rocket is coasting farther from the Earth, altitude 322 kilometers and climbing. That decreasing velocity is caused by Earth's gravity tugging on the rocket as it climbs higher above the planet. Here's a view of Amazonas Nexus still fastened to the forward end of the upper stage of the Falcon 9. That will be deployed. That payload will be separated in about 7 minutes or so.
Acquisition of signal. Heart of B stock.
32 minutes into the flight. If you on this view, you can actually see two different clocks. On the upper right is the actual time since the liftoff, 32 minutes, 30 seconds now approaching that point in the flight. At the bottom, the clock a little bit behind, that's the clock we're receiving from SpaceX's webcast, which does have some latency in it, a bit of a delay there. Nice views of the Amazonas Nexus satellite still attached to the Falcon 9 rocket. About 3 minutes until that payload is deployed. Falcon 9 has just passed into an orbital sunrise flying over Africa, near the Great Rift Valley region of Africa. Soon we'll be passing over the Indian Ocean, passing over the islet of Madagascar. The rocket is now in range of a downrange tracking station in South Africa.
Down orbit insertion.
We just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control, a bit delayed, but confirming that the restart
Expected loss of signal, Gabon.
of the upper stage engine did indeed place the Amazonas Nexus spacecraft into the expected orbit. Less than a minute now until payload separation.
Payload separation confirmed.
And there's separation of the Amazonas Nexus satellite for Hispasat. This spacecraft, built by Thales Alenia Space, is beginning a 15-year mission to provide connectivity for users on land, at sea, and in the air over the Americas
Acquisition of signal, Maldives.
and the Atlantic Ocean. A big focus of this satellite will be to provide in-flight connectivity for airlines over the Americas and the North Atlantic. Great view here of that spacecraft in sunshine over Africa. Continuing to head out over the Indian Ocean next. The spacecraft will be unfurling its solar panels. That'll be one of the next big milestones in the mission. And then the spacecraft will use its own plasma propulsion system for a series of orbit-raising maneuvers to actually reshape its orbit from its current elliptical path loop around the Earth to a circular orbit over the equator. That'll take several months, and then Amazonas Nexus is scheduled to enter commercial service sometime in July, according to Hispasat. It's heading for an operational position at 61 degrees west longitude in geostationary orbit. Here's a look at the spacecraft as it appeared before the launch, with its solar arrays and antennas folded up in configuration to fit inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9. Now that it's flying free of the rocket, it's now able to unfurl all of those appendages. The solar arrays will actually extend out to a span of more than 100 feet or 30 meters. It will be joining Hispasat's operational fleet and eventually replacing a satellite called Amazonas 2 that's been in space since 2009. With this mission now complete from SpaceX's perspective, let's take a look at some of the mission stats. This was the 202nd launch of the Falcon 9 rocket, or of a Falcon 9 rocket, since 2010. The 212th launch overall of SpaceX's Falcon rocket family since 2006. That tally includes not only the Falcon 9, SpaceX's workhorse, but also the Falcon 1, now retired, and the Falcon Heavy launch vehicle as well. This was the 6th flight of the booster numbered 1073 in SpaceX's inventory. This was the 173rd Falcon 9 launch from here in Florida, the 112th SpaceX launch from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, the 167th launch overall from Pad 40. Pad 40's history dates all the way back to the 1960s. The very first launch from Pad 40 was a Titan rocket in 1965. So this marks the 167th flight overall from this launch complex. This was the 143rd flight to utilize a reused Falcon 9 booster. It's the 170th successful landing of a Falcon booster that includes Falcon 9s and Falcon Heavies. This was the 2nd launch by SpaceX for the Spanish company Hispasat, the 9th SpaceX launch of this year, and the 7th launch from Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center to start 2023. Looking ahead to the launches we'll be covering over the next week or so. Later this week, on Thursday actually, will be the launch of a Soyuz rocket from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. This will be carrying the Progress MS-22 cargo freighter to the International Space Station, carrying several tons of food, supplies, clothing, and experiments, water, and fuel up to the orbiting research complex. That launch is scheduled for Thursday night U.S. time, early Friday local time at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the launch site in Kazakhstan. Later on Friday will be the launch of the SSLV, that's the Small Satellite Launch Vehicle from the Indian Space Research Organization. It will be carrying several satellites into low Earth orbit, including EOS-07, an Earth observation satellite, as the primary payload. This will be the 2nd flight of India's new SSLV, Small Satellite Launch Vehicle, after a test flight last year ended in failure. So this is a redo of that test flight to prove out this new launch capability for India. Later this weekend, actually, no earlier than Saturday, will be the next launch from Pad 40 here at Cape Canaveral. Also the next SpaceX mission with the Starlink 5-4 mission, carrying another batch of Starlink Internet satellites into orbit. That launch currently is scheduled for no earlier than 12:07 a.m., just after midnight Saturday, Eastern Time, 5:07 a.m. UTC Saturday. However, the turnaround for this launch at this same launch pad will be a bit tight, so we'll see if the delay in this launch tonight that was originally scheduled for yesterday, we'll see if that results in a ripple effect, so to speak, on this next mission from Pad 40, if it's going to be delayed a day. We'll see. We'll have updates on that on our launch schedule as well as on social media later this week. Close out our launch calendar look ahead. We'll be covering the launch February the 11th, or February the 13th rather, from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, another Falcon 9 rocket, another batch of Starlink satellites going into orbit from the West Coast next Monday the 13th of February. So now 43 minutes since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. We'll conclude our live coverage now. We thank you for joining us for the launch of Amazonas Nexus for Hispasat on board SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. We'll have our next live stream this weekend for the launch of Starlink 5-4, SpaceX's next mission from here on Florida's Space Coast. For continuing coverage of the wider space program, you can go to our website, www.spaceflightnow.com. You can also follow us, Spaceflight Now, on Twitter and on Facebook for updates as well. We'll see you in a few days for the next mission from here on Florida's Space Coast. Thanks for joining us. Have a great night.